I'm Neil Patterson. Welcome to the Daily, and it is All Change at Main Building. Now, for the uninitiated, that is the somewhat less than exciting name for the Ministry of Defence headquarters, situated just off Whitehall, where there has been, and I fully intend this pun, a changing of the guard. We had long known, of course, that Ben Wallace would be stepping down as Defence Secretary. The news that Grant Shapps would be his replacement, well, it certainly took me by surprise, at least. Now, he has got absolutely no experience in military matters. There is that. However, he has certainly done the rounds when it comes to government jobs. Let me just run you through them. In under a year, he has served as Transport Secretary, Home Secretary, admittedly only for 6 days, Business Sec, Energy Sec. He's now taking over Defence, with war in Ukraine continuing to rage. Now, on this episode, we will be taking a look back at Ben Wallace's tenure, examining Grant Shapps' suitability for the job, and once again taking in the most recent events from Ukraine, including those drone strikes deep into Russian territory. To that end, I am joined by our International Affairs Editor, Dominic, Waghorn, and our military analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Gentlemen, great to have you back on the podcast. Dom, to you first. We have had the exchange of letters that is traditional at moments such as this. Ben Wallace's, somewhat different to the one that Nadine Dorris wrote to the Prime Minister not that long ago. Plenty of praise, but he makes a couple of points in it.
He does, and I think we expected him to be going, and he's going for personal reasons. And I think his passing will be lamented by many in the defence establishment, but also in Kyiv. And I think a lot will be said about the fact that he had all this military experience, and Grant Shapps has none of it. But I think also it's going to be a huge change in style. Ben Wallace was the kind of bulldog in this job. He was the gruff, combative defence secretary. He said it how it was. He early on in the invasion, he said that Vladimir Putin had gone full Tonto. I enjoyed putting those words to Maria Zakharova, the Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman, and then sort of standing back and watching her explode in her reaction. And I think instead of a bulldog, we're going to have now more of a Labrador. Grant Shapps is a kind of pleasing, obedient, telegenic man, and that will go down well within...
I can't wait to see Grant Shapps' face when I tell him that he's been described as a Labrador.
Well, you get my point in that sort of canine comparison. And I think, there will be those who will say that Rishi Sunak is playing it safe appointing him. He's a very loyal apparatchik. But for a Prime Minister who's as behind the polls as Sunak is, he maybe have wanted to have done something more bold. That'll be for those Westminster watchers to decide. But I think in Kyiv, there will also be some disquiet about Shapps' appointment. And Ben Wallace was, alongside Boris Johnson, he was one of the two real champions of the Ukrainian cause, not just in Westminster, but in the alliance. And he galvanised morale within the defence establishment here, but also in the alliance. And Shapps, I think, has a lot to prove if he's going to try and match that. And I think, Wallace's passing will be lamented in Kyiv, and they will be slightly uneasy, I think, about his replacement.
Michael, what did you make of Ben Wallace as Defence Secretary? I mean, I have to say, I've interviewed him a number of times over the years, particularly around actually the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, you knew that this was a man who was in command of his brief. You knew that this was a man who understood to an extent, the pressures that were on the armed forces. From your perspective, good job, bad job?
Yeah, no, he did a good job. I mean, as far as he was allowed to. Scots Guards officer, so he had that credibility. And remember, he turned down the ideas that he might stand as Prime Minister during the chaos of the Conservative Party after 2016. And he eschewed any further political ambitions. I think that's probably wise on his part in any case. And partly the reason he's going is because his own constituency of Preston North and Wyre is disappearing in the boundary changes. So the idea of having to fight another constituency and then probably, on the scale of things at the moment, look as if they might go into opposition, didn't get the NATO Secretary-General's job, which he would have been very good for, but there's a lot of politics behind that. Wasn't his fault. They were never going to give it to the British Foreign Secretary, a British Defence Secretary, as opposed to some of the other candidates. And so from a personal point of view, it makes sense for him to step down, as it were, and move on. But he goes with a reputation for having done a job with some integrity as well as he could. He got a 4-year financial settlement for the MOD, which is not enough. It's not adequate to meet the black hole that they're in, because there's a structural problem of defence spending which goes back well over a decade. And so he did as well as he could within the constraints he was operating in. And I suspect that when he goes onto the back benches and then becomes a private citizen working for, a bank or a consultancy, whatever else he ends up doing, because he's only in his mid-50s and he's only early 53, 54 at the moment, So we'll certainly hear more from him. And I think what we'll hear from him will be quite critical of the way defence has been handled, not of the MOD necessarily, but the way the government has approached defence over the last decade or more.
I mean, Dom, structural problems, yes, at the MOD, understandably. We've also got inflationary pressures on top of defence spending, and we've got all the stuff that we've sent to Ukraine that we need to replace. I mean, there are two lines in the letter that leap out to me. The letter from Ben Wallace to Rishi Sunak. I know you agree with me. We must not return to the days where defence was viewed as a discretionary spend by government and savings were achieved by hollowing out. I genuinely believe that over the next decade, the world will get more insecure and more unstable. Look, I suppose if you're working inside main building at the moment, Grant Shapps would not be the name at the top of your list if you were looking to go to the Treasury and get more money.
Exactly, and he's not going to be banging the drum as much as Wallace did. In a very outspoken way, he's saying there was more money needed, and as you say, that's I think that stands out to me as well. And also saying that we both share the belief that now is the time to invest, but they don't agree on how much to invest. And Shapps is far more likely to fall in line with Sunak on that front. You know, inflation is one of the challenges. Organisation, the bureaucracy of defence. There are all sorts of challenges in terms of modernising the British military, and there seems to be consensus across the board that more money is needed. It's just how much and where it comes from.
Michael, I mean, do you have to be a military man to be effective in the role as Defence Secretary? There have been plenty who have not been, and who have gone on to, for example, be head of NATO in later life. I just wonder, at a time like this, however, where we have the kind of the nuclear submarines needing looked at, where we are replacing outdated technology within our armed forces, whether it might not have been better to have someone who actually understands the kit questions in a way that Grant Shapps may well end up doing, but doesn't right now.
Well, you certainly don't have to be a military person to be a successful defence secretary. So you think about, George Robertson was pretty good. John Reid, no military experience. He was a fairly effective defence secretary. Michael Heseltine, one of the previous Conservatives in the previous era, was a pretty effective defence secretary. Dennis Healey, very effective defence secretary in the 1960s, though he did have some early military experience, I think. But you certainly don't need it. What you do have to have is the instinct to be a good CEO, a good chief executive officer. You've got to be able to manage a big organization with a big budget. And there aren't many people in politics, certainly not these days in politics, who do have that. So, I mean, one of the things that, political analysts like Dominic and myself, we spend our time not thinking so much about party labels or party affiliations. We think about competence, technical competence. Which politicians can handle big issues, which can run big departments, has got some weight when it comes to cabinet discussions in arguing their case, always as well with a sense of what is in the national interest or the interests of the government. And so, in a way, you judge Ben Wallace and Grant Shapps not so much on whether they understand military issues at a junior officer level. Remember, Ben was only ever a captain in the Royal Scots Guards, which is not a particularly high level, but it gives you a sympathy with the forces, gives you a way of speaking to the forces, though not necessarily in his case with the Navy and the Air Force, because the forces are very tribal. But that's not so important. What's really important is that ability to be an executive of a big spending department. And there's no evidence that Grant Shapps really is that. I mean, the two jobs that he had that lasted more than a few months, he spent 3 years as Transport Secretary. That's quite a big job. And 3 years as Chairman of the Conservative Party. That's not a big spending job. And otherwise, he did 6 months in energy, 3 months as Business Secretary, 6 days as Home Secretary. I mean, there's no evidence that Grant Shapps, he may have this ability, but there's no real evidence that he has that executive ability. One thing I would like to say, in case nobody else does say it about Grant Shapps, is that he, without any political publicity or fanfare or no sense of political opportunism, he took a Ukrainian family, and his family took in a Ukrainian family for a year. And he just did it on a personal basis. And I give him enormous credit for that. And nobody else in this next 24 hours might say that. So I'm glad that I have.
No, thank you for making the point. I mean, Dom, just to pop your kind of diplomatic hat back on for a second. Isn't there also a role with the Defence Secretary that there has to be a personal projection of power? I think to Ben Wallace standing up at NATO, saying, Mr Putin, we are in this for the long haul. And perhaps that wouldn't have made Vladimir shake in his boots or anything like that, but you certainly took the point. I'm wondering what in Moscow and in Kyiv people will be thinking about someone who has, as we have mentioned a number of times, done the round trip of Whitehall in the past 12 months, what they'll be thinking about his abilities?
Well, I think in Moscow they're not going to be quaking their boots at Shapps' appointment. I don't think they'll care an awful lot. I think in Kyiv they will feel he has to prove his worth to them, and I think Shapps is he's a bright man. He
very, very.
Yeah, and he's very nimble-minded, and warfare is changing dramatically, and the military, what the military need now will be very different in a few years' time, and so it will need a bright mind, someone who can grapple with all these challenges, but also to argue in his defence. He's not somebody who's going to be out there in the front saying we need all this from Downing Street, grandstanding, but he does have the Prime Minister's ear, and so if he can go and present a cogent argument, he may be able to bring about the kind of outcome that maybe those within the Ministry of Defence need in terms of financial investment. So I think he may use the same skills. It's going to be a very different style, but I think within the alliance, he's going to have those personal skills maybe in a more quiet way, back-channel way, to try and bring about change and influence through the alliance, which is going to be important in Kyiv's favour.
And Michael, just a final word on this. I mean, is there perhaps also an argument for saying, given the kind of the structural issues that have long plagued the Ministry of Defence, given the kind of the entrenched thinking that sometimes plagues those who work in main building, that actually bringing someone in from the outside might not be a bad idea, just if only to shake things up a little?
Yeah, I mean, Philip Hammond became Defence Secretary before he went to the Foreign Office with exactly that view. He was a business person. I'm coming in, I'm looking at this as a business place, not as a defence place, and here's what we're going to do to balance the budget. And that was partially successful for a little while, and it sort of drifted away after 2015. But there's always some benefit in having somebody who's fresh to a portfolio take it over. The problem in that respect for Grant Shapps is that this is not going to last very long. I mean, it'll go up to the election, so maybe 18 months. And if the Conservatives would win that election, it would be a surprise if somebody like Grant Shapps stayed at Defence. Could happen. But you need somebody. I mean, Ben Wallace did 4 years. You need somebody in a department like that to do 3 to 4 years or more. And that really doesn't happen very much. Certainly it hasn't happened in the last decade of British governments, because ministers have been on a complete merry-go-round because of the nature of our top-level politics.
Take us through recent events, because there does appear to have been, from the Ukrainian side in this conflict, an increasing use of drones. What, if anything, can we read into this tactic?
Partly it's because the Ukrainians lack air superiority, and it's harder for them to fight the deep battle, to actually attack Russian forces deep behind the lines. And so they've been using drones much more, not only to do that, but also to attack Russia directly. And that's a fairly controversial policy because it increases Putin's narrative that this really is an attack on Russia itself. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have done some fairly impressive things with a range of different sorts of drones. So they've repurposed some old Soviet-era surveillance drones that they had, some old Tupolev drones. They've created new ones, and they've created some of these mini drones. They've even now started to use some of these Australian cardboard and rubber band drones. They sound ridiculous, but they'll carry 4 or 5 kilograms of charge or camera, whatever, and they're absolutely invisible to radar because they're made out of a sort of a laminated cardboard, and they just go one way. They've been very inventive with their drones, and indeed, I mean, there have been 25 significant drone attacks on Russia just this month, and they're having some effect on the psychology of the war, if not on the military side of what's happening on the Russian side of the border.
I mean, but Dom, they're not entirely pea shooters, are they? I mean, certainly in the kind of the last couple of days, the length of these strikes and the effect that they're having, it is minimal compared to the scale of the Russian military operation, of course, but they are having an effect. Yeah,
no, they're spectacular. If you look at the pictures from Pskov, now this is an airbase that is hundreds of miles north of Ukraine. It's only about 20-30 miles east of Estonia. That's the most northern Baltic state. But from there, the Russians have been using, they have these huge Ilyushin transport planes. Very important if you're a country as big as Russia to transport arms and men around the country. And the Ukrainians managed to strike this airbase, as well as 6 other regions of Russia in the same night. So a very complex operation. And the pictures from Pskov were spectacular. These massive sort of walls of smoke lifting into the air, lit up by explosions on the ground. Now, the Russians say only 2 of these transport planes were destroyed. You know, to see whether it's more than that or not. And that has, I think, has an effect as as Mike was saying, psychologically on Russians.
Of course, yeah.
Who feel the war is getting closer and closer to them. And actually on some of this amateur video shot, they sound terrified, the Russians filming it, saying, Mike, what's going on here? Screaming. Very dramatic sounds from them. I think it does have some impact also in a sense, in a military sense, because there are a few of these planes to rush things around. And I think the timing's not coincidental, because this happened on the same week when the Ukrainians do now seem to be making more progress, trying to puncture through that belt of mines and defences the Russians have laid for 1,000 miles from the sea to their border near Kharkiv. The Ukrainians for weeks have been trying to get through that. They're making more progress now. And I think the Russians will want to reinforce the areas that they're now threatening. And of course, taking out transport planes will weaken that capability to send troops and weapons to reinforce it potentially.
I mean, Michael, Grant Shapps, of course, taking over as Defence Secretary, he will have decisions to make. He will have decisions to make as to what he sends to Ukraine. I mean, what in this area have we been able to provide, if anything?
Nothing. I mean, that's one of the problems, that we can provide lots of political support for Ukraine, supporting NATO, moral support and training. And we are doing something on training, both of ground troops and of Air Force training, or training of pilots. But in terms of equipment, we've virtually given the Ukrainians everything we can that's useful to them. Of course, some of us would argue, and I would argue, that we ought to actually break into the stocks we're keeping for ourselves and give those as well. I mean, Britain's Challenger 2 tanks, which we need, are not going to be on the German plane anytime in the next 2 or 3 years. So I personally, I'd give them all to the Ukrainians, because then they would, they would have some value in ways that we anticipated. But they're not going to, we're not going to do that. And the problem is that in terms of contributions, it's hard to think of what more, in a strictly military sense, Britain could do to help Ukraine. There's all sorts of other things we can do, but not on the military front.
Dominic, I mean, whenever we talk about this, you hear this kind of call from the Russian side saying, look, the use of US or UK munitions or technologies, we would assume this to be a direct act of war ourselves. That's never amounted to anything, has it?
No, but it is a problem. And I think, as Michael was saying, it's controversial what the Ukrainians are doing, attacking Russian targets beyond Russian borders. And the Ukrainians never comment about these drone attacks, because, the understanding is the West is arming them, giving what they need to defend against this unprovoked aggression and an invasion, on the understanding they don't use any of the advanced weapons that the West is giving them to attack Russian targets, except those in the occupying forces within their own borders. So they're using drones which are not Western supplied. They're kind of more homemade. But I think it's sort of pushing the envelope a bit, so it'll be looked on with some concern. I think the other important point to make here, following what Michael was saying, is that Ben Wallace was really crucial in terms of using Britain's influence to try and sort of break the logjam, particularly on tanks. Britain sent NLAWs. He would have been instrumental in that decision. But
he got stuff there before the war actually broke out, didn't he?
Yes, to a certain extent. But also over the tanks, there was this sort of you first, no me first thing between the Germans and the Americans over tanks. And what the British did was to say, well, we're going to send Challenger tanks. Only a dozen or so were promised, I think. But that broke the logjam, and Ben Wallace was very central to that move. And I think you have to wonder whether Grant Shapps would be quite so proactive. And the key thing now is sending F-16 jets. There's still a kind of foot dragging going on there, and the Ukrainians desperately need air power to support the counteroffensive, because they're trying to pull off something that's very hard to do without air superiority.
I mean, briefly, Michael, if you can, I mean, just your assessment, overall assessment of where we are in terms of that Ukrainian counteroffensive.
It's beginning to work. They've had the attrition phase. They're now moving more quickly. We'll see where they get to. They've probably got 2 months more of offensive to offer, and whether they'll reach the coast south of Tokmak or south of Velika Novosilka, we're not sure. But certainly they're in high gear now, and it is moving into a new phase. I suspect they'll do well, but not well enough to change the political balance of how people see the war itself.
And Dominic, kind of final word from you, away from Ukraine specifically, but of course this week we have seen the funeral of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. We all assume we know exactly what happened with that plane. We all assume that this was directed from the top. Has Vladimir Putin steadied the ship there?
I think he's shored himself up for now. But I think, and what he's decided to do was to deny Prigozhin, as you'd expect, the full honours he could have expected Prigozhin had he not launched this armed mutiny. He was a decorated hero of Russia. Under that honour, he could have had a state orchestra, a military escort, thousands of mourners, volleys of gunfire at his funeral. Instead, it was a hushed-up ceremony that not many people went to. And there's an alpha to omega quality to the extraordinary Prigozhin story that just goes on. He began life as a poor man, a common criminal. He was buried now alongside his father in a workers' cemetery. But I think the legend, the mystique of Prigozhin goes on, and that is potentially a problem for Putin. He has been seen as the kind of the common soldier's general. He was the man who, in the last days of before the mutiny, was spelling it out, saying what many of these soldiers on the front will feel, which is they were sent there on a lie, badly armed and badly trained. He was always the outsider in the court of Tsar Vladimir, and so he's now gone back to the kind of grave, the kind of final resting place that legend would kind of expect. And I think it sort of adds to this storyline. Potentially, it doesn't weaken Putin, making him more likely to be toppled. But I think it makes it, as we were saying last time we spoke, it makes him more brittle. And when he does eventually get toppled, if that happens, it could make that more of a spectacular outcome. He's more of a cracked figure now. I think more threatened by that.
The Wagner Group itself, though, the talk of insurrection, another insurrection, all of that seems to have gone away. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. Today we've had a video that has been put on a Wagner-affiliated Telegram channel, which is Prigozhin, it seems in Africa again, driving along and saying all those sort of rumours of me being liquidated, I'm still alive, I'm fine. So, there's always going to be this idea that potentially, is that hinting at the fact that actually he is alive, like a kind of Bond villain surviving the flames. All that's going to carry on, I think. Look, Wagner as a group is certainly being dismantled, and I think Putin took his time to do so, and it's being replaced by the Russian military intelligence units in Africa and across the world. But there's still a huge amount of resentment within this group who still see Prigozhin as their hero, and I think that could remain a problem for Putin.
Dominic, Michael Clark, great to have you back on The Daily. Thanks both for your input. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We have much more coverage, of course, of the Ukrainian war and indeed of the death, or indeed otherwise, of Yevgeny Prigozhin. You can find that on the podcast feed. We'll see you next time.